Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. And I'm Dr. Katharine. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of Alula Therapy. And really, Alula is very passionate about supporting parents, supporting children, because we really believe that parents are the gatekeepers of their children's well-being and emotional and social aspects of this are important. So I just want to take you through what we're doing today and give you an outline. So, first of all, really touching on what is emotional regulation. And then we go and look at how that applies to understanding the developing brain and why it's important to consider the development of the brain when we're thinking about emotions. Then we want to think about the idea of escalation. So, how emotions go up and come down. And this is foundational to understanding what we're doing when we're trying to regulate our emotions and our children's emotions. And then we'll talk through some practical strategies that you can utilize to support your children. And then we'll have some time for question and answer. And really, it's meant to be a discussive, open conversation. And so if you have any questions, feel free to stop and ask. And so we can just discuss and make sure you're following along and you're benefiting from the information that we're giving. So before I get into this and think about what emotion regulation actually is, I think there is a first place to start, which is what are emotions? They're normal. We all have emotions. Emotions, I like to describe them as flags. Like they are the flags within ourselves that tell us that there is something in our environment that we need to pay attention to, something that doesn't feel right to us, or something that we really want to take note of. So our emotions are the signals that go off in our brains and our bodies that move us into an active, action-oriented phase of being. So we don't have any bad emotions. We have positive emotions and we have negative emotions. But ultimately, all emotions are important and they serve a function. So this is important because a lot of the time, I often hear people say, that's a bad emotion because often we're referring to the behavior or the actions that we tend to take on the back of experiencing these emotions. So it's really important to just understand from the very beginning, we are talking about things that are in our experience that are meant to be there. And then the other thing that is important to remember is emotions go up and they come down. They don't stay static. So, in the height of any emotional experience, knowing that this emotion will gradually dissipate, it will reduce and it will pass through. That's another important thing to remember. And then there are differences that show up for individuals in the degree and the depth of emotional experience that they have. So some people are naturally more sensitive than others. And again, this is within normal human experience. So there's no right and wrong when it comes to an emotional experience and expression. There is an important survival reason for our emotions and our emotional experiences. And everybody has emotions, they're universal. And that's just important for us to bear in mind. Okay, so now we come and we think about what is emotion regulation, right? It refers to the ability to manage emotions. And something that is a core to take away from and think about when we think about emotion regulation is that it's about being able to, first of all, notice the emotion within ourselves. If we don't notice something, we're not doing anything with it. We might just be reacting to something, but we're not aware of it. So if we want to get to that place where we're able to manage our emotions, then we first of all need to be able to notice them. So I notice my emotions. The next thing I want to be able to do as part of this emotion regulation skill that is developing is to be able to label my emotions, to have the vocabulary, to have the words to put behind the feeling that I get, the reaction that I'm having to a stimulus, to an event. And so we're talking about noticing, or we're talking about labeling. And the next thing that is really crucial in developing emotion regulation as a skill and an ability is our ability to communicate with others about what we're experiencing. So first of all, I have to notice it. Then I have to be able to label it. And then I need to feel able to communicate that. So those are some of the key steps we talk about when we talk about emotional regulation. And then there's a set of skills. It's a set of skills that develops with age and experience. And here's the thing. We have to be taught these skills. They don't just naturally emerge. We will learn ways to cope if no one teaches us. But then some of those ways we learn might not be socially acceptable. They might cause us harm. They might cause others harm. And those become the type of emotion expressions that people find problematic, and maybe problematic for us as individuals as well. So remembering that emotion regulation is a skill, and it's a skill that is taught, and actually it's a skill that is taught throughout the course of our existence, because we're always learning, we're always being challenged, we're always facing new situations that require us to, adapt and function and know how to adapt and function. And so we're always learning about regulating our emotions, and especially when we're young, especially when we're talking about children all the way from infancy up until people in their 20s. Really learning a set of core skills that need to be supported by the adults around them. And then the idea of emotion regulation being something that is socially impacted. Expressing emotion in socially accepted ways is also a factor in emotion regulation, because in some contexts, some cultures, some situations, whether that be familial, be at school, be in organizations of different kinds, be in countries of different kinds, the way we express ourselves emotionally varies because of the social expectations around us. So this is also something to consider when we're thinking about emotion regulation. What might be acceptable in one context may not be considered acceptable in a different context. And so we really need to be thinking about that when we're discussing or thinking about teaching our kids how to regulate themselves. I think we've all had that kind of experience where, I don't know, maybe even within a family setting, within your nuclear family, you might have a way that you consider acceptable for people to express themselves. And then maybe you go into like an extended family context. It might be parents-in-laws, aunts and uncles, older generation. And the way your child is expressing themselves is frowned upon, because it's like, oh, well, we don't do things that way. And that kind of situation can be difficult. But it's being able to recognize and remember that not everybody is going to see this in the same way. There are some things that are relatively universal, I guess, but not everything. So we just want to be aware of that. And here we come on to the concept of escalation. What do we mean about emotions being something that can escalate over time? So looking at this graph on the screen, we have on one axis the emotional intensity, and on the bottom axis we have time. So over time, the idea being that over time, our emotions can peak, they can pick up, peak, and then they can drop, right? And this is what we refer to as the wave of emotions. Much like something you might see if you were looking out on the ocean, the waves go up and then they come down. And that is really important for us to remember, because it also gives us windows and opportunities where we can step in and support someone with their emotional experiences, because we know Often parents will say to me, "Oh, my kid goes from 0 to 100 in seconds," right? So basically, what they're saying is they go from this green regulated zone into this red dysregulated zone very quickly, sometimes in a way that is hard to perceive until we're dysregulated, until the child is, expressing or showing signs that emotionally they're not okay. Often we'll refer to this in bands, and we'll use the concept sometimes of colors. Green for regulation. Green means that zone where we are calm, where things are relatively moving on smoothly. And then the yellow is where we start to notice their shifts. The emotional intensity is picking up. And you'll notice a change in behavior, a change in approach. And then we go all the way into the red zone, which is considered dysregulation. This is the part of emotional experience where things have really intensified and will stay there for an amount of time. And then the emotion will start to drop off and we'll experience this reduction and a gradual return to our more regulated state. So how does this escalation actually impact behavior? What is it we actually see? So it's taking that concept and then mapping it onto what you might notice in your child's behavior. And remember, I think when we talk about behavior, we're often thinking about things that are much more externalized, but behavior can be something that is very internalized. And I just think that is a very important sort of distinction to make, because one child might be very expressive when they're dysregulated, and another child might be very shut down. So bearing that in mind and mapping that onto your child, because like I said earlier, there are individualized experiences, there's individual differences in how emotional intensity is experienced. So coming back to the idea of what will we see when this wave of emotion is going up and down. So in the green zone, in the regulated zone, we've got, again, we think about this physiologically. So more relaxed muscles, children, people engaged in activities, smile, laughter, conversation, things are flowing relatively smoothly. And then as the emotional intensity increases, we start to notice changes. So some agitation, fidgeting, distraction, maybe people becoming more vigilant of what's going on, maybe less vigilant and more zoned in. Children may become clingy. Some may become sort of detached and want to be away. But we start to notice this shift. And the behaviors that we were seeing when we noticed or are aware that our child or children are more regulated, calmer, start to alter. And if this emotional intensity continues to build, we end up with more, usually I would say more overtly obvious signs of distress, including muscle tension, some difficulty speaking, problems like taking in information. So it can be hard to listen and hear and follow direction and instruction. Tears is often common, shouting, raised voices, increased rate of speech and speaking, may seem more pressured, narrowed attention. So really, like we sometimes refer to it as tunnel vision. Like, if you observe a child who is really distressed, really dysregulated, sometimes looks like they just can't see anything beyond whatever they were focused on in that moment when they became distressed. And we might also have a level of risk behavior. This could be hitting out, it could be running off, it could be trying to throw things, trash things. Younger, very much younger children might do things like bite and hit themselves, hit other people. Older kids maybe the same. But all these behaviors are a result of the fact that the system our nervous system has now gone into what we refer to as the fight, flight, freeze zone, right? They're in this state where there's a perception of a threat, and the system is now telling us we need to react strongly. The flags are up, they're waving, and the system is responding accordingly. It's important to also remember that a lot of this is actually a survival mechanism. It's part of the brain that is helping us to respond to perceived threats. And it might sound odd to think about maybe even setting a boundary with a child as a threat in that sense. But the thing is, in a very primitive part of our brain, the things that we want, the things that we're seeking, the things that we need, if those things become blocked by something, there is a sort of perception of this feels threatening, this doesn't feel good, this feels unjust, this feels unfair. And so there is a consequent reaction to that. And this is often why we will experience this full body mind response to a perceived threat. So I just want to take a moment and look at this from a neuroanatomical perspective, the brain, essentially, right? When we talk about the brain and emotion together, sometimes it's curious, like, well, why do we need to think about the brain? Well, yes, not just because emotions are occurring in the brain, but also there are things that are going on within our brains that impact what we will see and will also impact then how we respond and how we support a child in terms of their building emotion regulation skills. So I will play a short video and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So something that is actually really important, and one point that I love to stress and highlight to parents, is that the brain continues to develop. The frontal, the prefrontal cortex of the brain continues to develop until a person is at least 25 years old, right? And that's such a shift in perception, because if we think about it, just like with any other evolving skill, like if we look at walking as a skill and we think about an infant all the way through to somebody maybe in their late teens and early 20s, there is ongoing mastery happening. So you don't start off, in your early years being able to walk and move yourself with that much coordination until you're quite a bit older. And we're saying that emotion regulation is dependent on a part of the brain that doesn't fully develop till we're 25. So our expectations of a child need to match with what their brains are capable of at that point in their lives. That's why it's often important to think about the concept of ages and stages. The age of a child might not match the stage of their cognitive development, their brain development. And similarly, you might have a child who is expected to be doing certain things at certain points, but maybe taking a bit longer for them to get to that phase. And if we are aware of that, and if we're matching what we do in practice with our children based on the child in front of us rather than the expectation of what this child is supposed to do, that's going to help. And especially when we come to the skill of emotion regulation, because there's often a perception that much younger children can regulate themselves in ways that actually are more in line with what an older child with an older, more developed brain can do. I'll give you an example of this. Often we will see young parents with quite young children, maybe in a social setting, like, I don't know, a social gathering, maybe like a dinner or, an event like church or, speech and prize giving day. And this thing is going to run on for maybe an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And we have a young child, and the expectation can be they're going to sit through this event and be calm and be engaged. And maybe, depending on the age of the child, they might manage 10 minutes. And then they're squirming and moving. And that can be pressurizing for parents because you're in a social setting, you're conscious of what's everyone else thinking. Other children look like they're sitting quite regulated, and mine's like wriggling and moving around. And that can feel really distressing for you. So you try and clamp down further, and then it basically, instead of moving your child from the yellow zone into the green, it actually has the flip and it moves it up to the red zone of increased dysregulation. What's happening there? We're actually trying to put the expectation of an older brain that could regulate maybe better in that setting onto a brain that isn't mature enough for the task at hand. And that creates an overload, and that creates dysregulation. So thinking about why that's important, and then looking at, well, what do we want to do with younger children? And the hand model of the brain is a lovely way of explaining this, explaining the fact that prefrontal cortex, the upstairs brain, is developing later, but also the idea that the downstairs brain, the amygdala, the part of the brain that is responsible for emotional responding, actually need to stay online and work together. And where they don't, where the stimuli comes in and creates flipping of the lid, the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain are not communicating in the way that we would hope any longer. And so if we see somebody in a state of dysregulation, that's coming from the downstairs brain rather than this nice problem-solving, logical part of the brain that is actually the part we really need in this kind of environment to actually sort of help us through. And what we're saying is the younger the child, first of all, this part of the brain not developed so well, but also that flipping of the lid happens much faster because also they just don't have the experience and the learning is going to enable them to stay connected in that way. So if we can think about those things when we're actually supporting our children, it's going to make a big difference. Okay, so coming back to think about why is this useful? Like I was saying earlier, it allows us to match the skills and expectations of the age and the level of emotional arousal that our child is experiencing, right? So the more intense the emotion experience, the higher or the faster this lid is flipping, right? So now we move to turning theory into practice. And it's really important. How do we take this information that we have and turn it into something that we can use in our day-to-day life? There's many, many different strategies we can use, many different theoretical approaches and frameworks. And given that this is just a short taster course, we are just going to talk about a few strategies that we think are pretty powerful. Now, first things first, where there's dysregulation, we are usually looking to bring about some calm. We're usually looking, the goal is often to bring children and ourselves back to a state of regulation. And here is one that can seem counterintuitive. Your child has flipped the lid, your child is escalated, your child is very distressed looking one way or another. And the suggestion that the parent stops and does an assessment of the situation sounds counterintuitive because let's be realistic. When your child is in dysregulation, you are likely also feeling dysregulated very quickly. And there is a reason for that, right? You're not meant to see your child from a survival perspective. You're not meant to see your child in distress and not have a reaction. you know, your system also goes into, there is a threat and I need to step in and I need to take action, and you become more reactive faster. But what we know from what we just talked about is if we're working from our downstairs brain, we're not actually thinking things through. We are reactive. We are coming from that, you know, real sort of fight, flight, freeze. Our nervous system is actually operating from a different standpoint than the one that we usually require when our children are dysregulated. We need to be in a more regulated state so that we can decide what's the most appropriate thing to do here, what will actually help the situation, and what could make it worse, right? That's why we say stop and assess. But there's a caveat to that, clearly. If there is an immediate danger, yes, we want to be reactive because that's a natural and appropriate survival instinct, right? We're going to protect. So if our child is in any kind of danger, we move quickly, we take action, and we do everything in our power to create the safety. However, if we're talking about a situation where there is no danger, nothing immediate, nobody's getting hurt, then actually we can pause. We can take a pause. And this pause can be anything from 7 to 10 seconds, where I notice the situation, I see what's going on, but I take a minute and I just take a deep breath. And that deep breath allows my upstairs brain and my downstairs brain to stay connected. That breath, that breathing, that deep breathing allows my nervous system to feel safe again, to know that, okay, the danger, the threat isn't, we're not in that DEFCON vibe. We're not in that very, very heightened place where we just need to be stepping in and taking action. That allows my system to come back to some form of regulation in itself. And this goes to that concept that I love to explain to parents about the container and the contained. As a parent, we're holding our children's emotions. And so if our children have these big explosive reactions and then we have big explosive reactions, we're actually magnifying the effect. Whereas if we can try and keep our lid down, like together, and our container tight, it means that the explosion that's happening for our child is contained. It stays within something that can hold it in place, right? And that's the importance of keeping ourselves regulated. That's why breathing, taking a minute, a beat, to just get ourselves back into regulation is so essential when we're looking at what we're going to do. And that's why I always say, start there, because that's the place we are going to be able to work from to bring our child back into a more regulated state. And then the next thing is actually to think about using our resources. And one of these resources is actually, even a step back from that, is noticing and validating our child's emotional experience. And this one often gets some friction when I talk about this with parents, because there's a perception that, well, if my child is angry and screaming and throwing things around, what on earth would I be thinking about validating in that situation? Remember what we said at the very beginning when we talked about the skills involved in emotion regulation. Remember, we talked about the importance of being able to notice something is going on in my body and my brain. I can label it. So I have words. All of a sudden, I have a word to use for this thing that is happening within me. That means my brain can click in and go, oh, I know what this is. I know what I'm feeling. I know there's not an existential threat. I know I'm not in imminent danger. And so I can start to do the work of regulating myself. And finally, there was that other skill set that was communicating. I can talk about this with somebody. I can let them into my inner world so they understand what is going on for me, right? So if we go back again to the idea that the skill is something that develops throughout the childhood and adolescence, then as a parent, in Each of these moments of escalation, I am trying to teach a skill. Because if my child has flipped their lid, chances are the skills they have are not matching the demands that are present in that situation. And that tells me that they need more guidance, they need more teaching. And this is where the noticing and the validating comes in, right? I notice what my child is going through so I can say to them, looks like you're really angry right now. Looks like you're really frustrated right now. I get it. I hear you. However, there is a however. What you're doing here, I need to stop you. Like if you're kicking, throwing, screaming, slamming doors, I can't let you do that. However, I can see something's going on for you and it doesn't feel good. So we need to deal with that. Okay. And I am going to use my words, I'm going to use my behavior, because also don't forget, so much of our communication is nonverbal. So if I'm using words that don't match my nonverbal behavior in their heightened state of arousal and dysregulation, your child is also picking up that information and it's escalating them further. It's moving them further away from the place where they're going to de-escalate and calm and further into that heightened state of threat perception. So your words are important. Your behavior is also important as a parent or an adult stepping in to support. What do I mean by your behavior? Sometimes it's as simple as, I'm telling you, I hear you, but I look so angry, so irritated, so frustrated with you that there is a mismatch. It is another threat cue. And it's hard. It's really, really hard as a parent to keep yourself in this kind of regulated state and to approach with openness when actually this feels everything but appropriate to you and something you literally just want to shut down very, very quickly. And I think here is where the old behavior of just instill fear, just dominate in that situation and shut it down and it stops. You're right, it does stop. The problem is children don't learn how to regulate. They learn to respond to fear. So your threat is bigger than the threat that set them off in the first place. So that squashes that. But they haven't learned anything other than if you're not there to instill the fear, they don't know what to do with their emotions. They don't know how to notice them. They don't know how to label them. They don't know how to communicate about them. And this is where we can result or have a result later down the line of emotions that we find unmanageable, right? Our children are either in distress because they're externalizing a lot in situations, maybe in school, maybe with their peers, maybe in their relationships further down the line, or they're internalizing, right? So they are depressed, they're anxious, they're highly, dysregulated in situations. They're shut down sometimes because all they've learned to do is detach from the emotional experience. So this idea of noticing and validating doesn't suggest that you cannot have a boundary with your child and have what is acceptable and appropriate. That doesn't mean that. But it means in the moment of the heightened regulation, that isn't really the teaching they need. The teaching they need is what is going to help me come back to a place of safety and regulation. That's the teaching they need. The teaching about what's appropriate and not can come later. And this is the thing I will say to parents, even that later can be a week later, because for some very sensitive children, if you broach the learning about the acceptance or acceptability of a behavior, it dysregulates them again and they go into a secondary cycle. So what we want to do is establish safety and reconnection. Like we want them to feel back to being safe with us and emotionally connected to us. And it's in that environment that we're going to be able to bring in some more learning, right? So noticing and validating can look like, I hear you. I hear you, right? I really hear you. This decision I'm making, I know you're finding it really hard. I see that. However, I don't know, it is bedtime. However, I'm sorry, you can't stay on your phone. However, right? But I hear you. And your emotion, you're okay. Like you can be angry, you can be frustrated. Um, but I'm going to help you to come back to a place of calm. That might look like, this is the resources that I may want to use. That might look like, listen, I think you need a bit of time. This is not about naughty step, and it's not about go to your room and disengage. This is more just I'm guiding you to reduce the stimuli coming in. So you might need to take some time, right? And I'll give you a few minutes and I'll come back. I'll be right over there, but I'll just give you a few minutes, right? It might look like if your child is willing to just give them a big hug, make them feel safe again. You're using your body language to tell them like, we're okay, we're still connected, I still love you. It's going to be okay. I might give you a sense of a hope, like, look, we can't do this right now, but we'll do some more of it tomorrow, so don't worry, like this stuff isn't gone forever. We're teaching them how to learn how to expand their window of tolerance for things, how to stay in the distress and not feel like the world is coming to an end, right? That is an important part of what we're teaching and the resources we're learning alongside our child to use, because every child is different and each situation can be different, right? So what might work at home might not work when you're out in public for various reasons, right? And so it's knowing that you have a toolbox of your own and you can take things out and try them and see what works. And you having the confidence that, yeah, I've got some tools I can use, also reduces the stress and pressure that you feel when your child starts to become dysregulated. You don't go into panic. You don't become dysregulated yourself because you're like, you know what, I can handle this. It's okay. I kind of know what I'm going to do and how I'm going to help them come back to a place of calm. And these are some of the really key and crucial things that we want to remember when we're trying to bring about calm. And similarly, thinking about restoring calm, there's a concept that I really love, that I love to explain to parents, because I just think it's a very useful way for us to conceptualize what's happening for our children, right? And it's also the same for adults. This bucket of the concept of the stress bucket applies to both adults and children. And I like to think about it in terms of, if we're really thinking of our brains as a bucket, right? And we're thinking that a bucket has a capacity, it has a limit, it has a level at which, it can hold liquid, and then it starts to overflow. And we map that back onto the concept of the wave of emotion, right? So the overflow is the red zone. The overflow is where the emotional stimulation has peaked. Our bucket is overflowing. And then I would say the green zone is probably, somewhere where this liquid level looks right now in the bucket. There's still room to go. So there's more stimulation that can come in, more demands can come into the bucket, and we'll still be okay. We're still not overflowing. And the thing that is important to think about with the bucket is that there are things that fill the bucket and there are things that drain the bucket. So our capacity for coping with things, our capacity to cope goes up and down. It's not a static thing. It's very dynamic, and it depends on what's happening in our environment, right? And that can be an external environment and internal. Like our heads can be full and busy just with thoughts, worries, thinking about, I don't know, school starting, or I have to go and see that friend of mine that I've had a bit of a thing with, or that teacher, and this piece of coursework or homework that I haven't done that I'm struggling with, or I just want to be left alone to play my PlayStation. Why is everyone kind of, haranguing me? All those things. And then there are the external demands, right? Like, you've got to do things at a certain time, to wake up at a certain time, bed at a certain time. All these things create changes in our capacity to cope with incoming demands. So if we think about the idea that bucket levels going up, going down, things that drain the bucket, so then they reduce the building tension and stress, increasing our capacity to cope with the new things. And then there are things that fill the bucket that mean that our capacity is reduced, and therefore we have less bandwidth to take in new things. We're onto a winner here, because now we can start playing around with this. And something that I think is a really useful concept for parents to think about is a concept of rev and relax. Like, I like to refer to it as a rev and a relax. Now, a rev is all the stimuli that fills the bucket, right? And that can be positive and negative. So we don't just think about this in terms of demands in a negative way. If I've had the most exciting experience this morning, I've been in some amazing soft play, or I've had this amazing football match, or, I don't know, I've just watched this really exciting film, or I've just been on this game that I love, and, I've been on it and like revved. It's created like an emotional wave, right? Like the intensity of my emotional experiences have gone up, which means there's ultimately less capacity for new things coming in and making demands on my nervous system. So if we're planning our day, we want to think about a mixture of activities. We want to think about activities where we are revved, so they're exciting, they're interesting, they're stimulating. And then we want to think about activities that allow us to relax, to reduce the stress levels, to reduce the pressure, to reduce the demands, to increase ultimately the capacity in our brains so that our children can cope. And don't forget, again, going back to the neuroanatomy, our children's buckets, if you like, are smaller. The capacity is much less than somebody who has a fully developed brain, like an adult brain. So, we think about things in micro doses as opposed to, maybe a child might need stimulation breaks, rest breaks after shorter periods than a fully grown adult, right? We can tolerate things for longer, usually, sometimes, than children can. So we just want to be thinking about these things as we're planning the day. So, maybe a child has just come back from school. They've had a full day of demand all day. It's understandable that when they come home, limited capacity. So we want to initially give them the opportunity to reduce that level so that they can take in new demands, right? So your child just walks in through the door, full day of school. I'm not going to go straight into let's go and do your homework. That's not going to work. It might, depending on your child, but usually we're going to see some kind of resistance. And that's natural. That's coming from a place of, I don't have bandwidth. I don't have this ability at this point to take in and work with more demand. And you're more likely to see a de-escalation in a situation like that. So here are some of the things you can do to reduce sensory stimulation. You can, obviously, like I said, link it to schedules. If you have a busy morning, you have a quieter afternoon. If you have a very exciting event, have a calmer event. You have a very demanding experience, have one that is of low demand. You could shift environments. Some environments are noisy, they're highly stimulating. And then we think about, okay, well, we've just come from this very noisy, busy place, and now we might want to come to a calmer place. That might include your home environment, by the way. You might have a room in your home, which is generally quieter. TV's off, games are off, phones are off, that kind of stuff. And there's a nice to just chill out zone. We can just go there and we can just relax. So if you notice, let's say that my child's looking a bit agitated, let's just pop over there and have a chill out, right? We don't have to wait till they're fully escalated before we suggest that, because likelihood is that by that point, it's going to be hard for them to manage the emotions that they're experiencing. Redirection is a good one. I see maybe two kids starting to get into it, and I can tell they're both getting increasingly dysregulated. I might say, hey, come and do this instead. I might point out to it and say, oh, looks like you two are really starting to get quite, heated here. I think it'd be a good idea to just like calm it down for a few minutes. So come here, let's do this. even if they seem like they're getting, highly excitable and their play is like, wild and they're really enjoying it, you can usually hear if you listen in, there's that cusp they get to, and then things start getting kind of heated. They're becoming dysregulated. And it's important because they're still children and they're still learning for the adults around to just step in and help them to get some regulation back. And then they can carry on with the game that they were playing. But we're just helping them to dip back into this zone of regulation so that they can cope with the demands, even in the play that they're having. And engaging in enjoyable activities is a really great way of draining the bucket, like reducing stress, pressure, and demand that has been placed in the bucket. So your child will be different. Some children will like more physical activities, some will like quieter activities, music, drawing, baking, talking, just lying in a bed. Some kids come home and they just want to stretch and swing, and all these things are useful ways of helping your child learn how to reduce the load that they're carrying. And now an acronym that I really love that I matches into this idea of the stress bucket is HALT. So hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Now, if we bear this in mind, along with this concept of the bucket and what we can tolerate and bandwidth, HALT points to those factors that will often very, very quickly impact the level in our bucket, right? If I'm hungry, I probably can't tolerate very much. If I'm angry, similarly, right? If I'm lonely and if I'm tired. And it seems like a very simple idea and concept. And yes, I'm not saying that there is not lots of other things happening. But if we can just bear these four things in mind, hungry, something happening in my system that doesn't feel comfortable. Angry, there's something in my environment that feels unfair, unjust, and I'm reacting to it. Lonely, I'm lacking connection and I'm feeling isolated. These are all threats to our system, by the way. Tired, I have limited bandwidth. I can't process as much. I can't take in information as much. Things just feel like they're overloading my system very, very quickly. That's why this acronym is so powerful, and it's a useful one to just use when we're kind of trying to work out sometimes what's happening with our child. Like, oh, they're being really grouchy. What time is it? Oh, right, it's almost lunchtime. They might be hungry, right? I know my child didn't sleep well last night, so I might anticipate that they're going to struggle with the activities they've got planned for today, right? They might have a bad day at school, come home, feel really lonely, feel really disconnected. And oh, yeah, maybe that's what they're seeking in that moment, right? So when we see the behaviors, we see the escalations, we're getting a better sense of what's going on. And here are some of the things that are important. We just want to soothe the nervous system again. We can do some sensory play, some physical touch, just like some real reconnection, just having a chat, just doing something together. Hey, look, I'm chopping up vegetables. Can you come and help me? Or I'm taking the dog for a walk. You want to come with me? Or just sit in their room with them. Like, hey, can I come in? Or, like, oh, what are you doing? And just engage them in conversation about something, that they're interested in. And sometimes your child isn't receptive yet. Their bucket might feel too full for your intervention. So your calm space, your contained, regulated presence co-regulates them. And they can gradually, if you like, piggyback off that to allow their nervous systems to start coming back to a place of regulation. So it's not always the things that you do. Often it's your presence and how you show up is going to be the thing that can act as an anchor, as a container for your child, right? And there's this phrase that we often use, which is just don't just do something, sit there. Because as a parent, like I was saying earlier, there's this sense that I need to take action, I need to do, and the doing can look like busy things, actions I'm taking. But actually, what we know is that your calm presence actually activates a part of the brain that creates a sense of safety that allows your child's nervous system to soothe. So this is just a precursor to our 6-week emotion regulation course. We go into so much more depth. And it's not just material that is delivered, in a very sort of didactic way where we just tell you what to do. It's very much an interactive course. So we deliver the information to you very much in this manner, and then we work with you to troubleshoot, to apply it to your own personal experience. Because at Alula, we really, really believe that the way parents can actually learn best, the way we all learn best, is through application, trial and error, because there is no perfect answer. There is no right and wrong, essentially. There is what works for you in your situation. And we know that where parents feel confident about the information that they've taken in and a sense that they know how to use it, things change faster, improvements appear, confidence builds. And this is what we're all about. This is why we planned our courses in this way. We also have our web app, which is part of this support that we give because it needs to be wrapped around your day-to-day life. You need to feel as if, look, if I'm going through a rough bedtime, I can message somebody, leave a message, and they will get back to me. They will help me with the questions I have because I'm learning on the go rather than trying to store all this information in my head until the next time, maybe a week, 2 weeks later, before I have an opportunity to speak to somebody who knows my situation and can give me some guidance. Our web app is very much about that. Gives you insights, you can track as well. You can see the patterns that are emerging through the data. And you have your own bank of very customized, personalized resources as well that match the kind of difficulties you're having and the goals that you've set for yourself. And overall, Alula is building 6 pillars of parenting. And this has come from the years of experience we've had working with parents and children in all manner of settings, organizations, schools, care homes, in the courts, just parents parenting in the real world. And we know that there are certain things that come up over and over again. And so we've built our 6 pillars around these foundational elements of parenting that we really believe parents need to know and need to understand with support. Because yes, of course, you can read, you can do everything yourself, but it's good to be able to do this with support and guidance. And that's what Alula is all about. So thank you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to seeing you on some future webinars and in our courses. And give us a follow. We're on Instagram. We're also a monthly newsletter that goes out. Can't wait to see you there.